Okay, you guys ready?
Yep. Go for it.
All right, let's go.
All right, good morning. Karl Kaufmann and Kirsten Burgard here from DC. We're talking about becoming
I'm
a user.
Kirsten.
We're talking about becoming a user advocate, and of course coming into user experience and why this is important as developers and working on sites. And as Don Norman and Jacob Nielsen of Nielsen Norman Group state, that it encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. And although, of course, most of their clients are for-profit, this applies to government projects and nonprofits as well. Just a brief introduction about Kirsten.
Me. I am what you call a gov geek. I work for the U.S. Department of State. And I am actually a Drupal developer there, which is really cool because my last agency did not let me say that. I am also the founder of Drupal for Gov, which is an organization that's becoming a nonprofit this year, where we do lots of events, webinars, and training for government employees, all through not just the US, not just DC, but we actually do them for across the world. We also do a large event every year called Drupal GovCon, which is how I got to know Karl.
And about myself, I started out as a visual designer, mostly doing print branding work, much less of that these days. It's more web design, information architecture, content strategy. And of course, how I got to know Kirsten is more through doing Drupal projects, site building, and architecture. And most of my work these days is on Drupal sites. As far as why user experience is important, because if it encompasses everything we do, and this also has to be happening at the developer level, and that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. It's not something that's going to be sprinkled on at the end, but needs to be built up from the ground up, as well as when it comes down to good coding practices is equally important. Aligning user experience goals with your organizational goals will enhance your organization's ability to fulfill its mission, enable users to more quickly achieve their goals, empower greater community engagement. And part of the challenge also is, and we notice this especially when it comes down to recruiters, when looking for people that are UX practitioners, is that user experience is not user interface. I kind of give a brief analogy to it. You take, for example, a dining experience. You start out here with the raw materials, which are the content. The utensils we use to use it are the user interface. User experience covers all of that. It's basically how the end user, which in this case would be somebody as a patron of a restaurant or even at the family dining table, on how they're going to basically consume this food. And of course, the thing behind it is that there's so many aspects to user experience. It's really difficult to nail a lot of this down into a simple, into basically a simple definition. And the main thing that we have to bring up, of course, when it comes down to Drupal sites and when it comes down to back-end administration, of course, it can be extremely difficult to follow. And I've noticed this even taking on projects for others. And I think that's where we have to, as developers, also advocate for the users on that. I'll briefly go over the principles of user experience. It's usually good to break it down into segments. Peter Morville did a good job on that. It comes down to a series of questions. Is what we're doing useful? Is it usable? Is it desirable? Is it findable? Is it accessible? Is it credible? And finally, of course, this business proposition, is it valuable? Going a little bit more into that, I think the main thing that we need to look into it's more like than filling in boxes, say, that are set up by a project management chart. We have to be asking how useful it's going to be, and that's where our skills come in, is to basically coming in and taking that brief requirement and making sure that it is actually helping the end users achieve their goal. That brings us into usability. And of course, it doesn't address everything, but it is a necessary component. That brings us into the next, which is it desirable? I know Apple often gets dinged for this, and of course we're focusing more times on atmospherics, but the thing behind it is, and this even comes down to business processes, if people don't actually like using it, how successful will it be? They're only going to put in the minimum effort to it. Granted, branding may not be of a major concern for a lot of government and nonprofit projects, but it's still extremely important to how people are going to relate to that, and that will affect their perception of the overall organization. Findability. This is extremely important on large government websites. I'd cut my teeth on 20,000 plus page sites before, and I think it's where information architecture, and especially if how things line up from the development standpoint, work with this. And also when it comes into accessibility, and this is becoming a larger issue today because of a lot of cognitive, not only physical challenges that many users have. And all of us will probably have some type of an accessibility issue at some point in our lives. Brings us into accessibility. And of course, as I will stress, and of course most of you probably already know, when it comes down to even search engine rankings today, Google of course is starting to ding sites if they're not following accessibility guidelines. And of course, if we're doing any government work, 508 is of course going to be baked into the project requirements to begin with. And of course, it's good business overall, I think, by making your content as easily accessible to the overall public as possible. Credibility, I think, is also something that also comes into the accessibility and findability issues. Part of the challenge there is, of course, sometimes there may be some desire by management on a team to be guiding users in a certain way that they may not want to do. Sort of like these gray patterns and dark patterns when it comes down to user experience, as they're often called. That, of course, can have a major impact upon the credibility of the organization. And, of course, delivering value. Here, of course, is it advancing the mission? I know Kirsten and I were talking the other night about a site that she needed for some work. Found it easier to actually go out here and do a search on Google versus using the navigation on the site. And I think that's where user testing is one of the things that really needs to be done at that point too. If we've been immersed on a project for a large amount of time, a lot of things that may be second nature to us won't be to somebody who hasn't done it yet. As far as the process is concerned, I've looked at a number of different processes over projects I've worked on, whether it was even a small one-off project or even on larger teams. One thing that I found successful about it is design thinking. And it kind of gets knocked at times in the design field, but I think the main thing behind it is it's not making everybody a designer, but more to think of a designer. Basically coming down to answer a few key questions. And I would say one of the best aspects I find about working on a design thinking workflow is to kind of combine it with Agile. Especially for me, if I have a large amount of time to be working on a project, I find that I get wrapped up too much in the details and not really focusing over whether each segment of this project is actually going to work and contribute to the goals. As far as the process overview is concerned, answering the question of what is. That's when you're basically coming out here and just trying to frame the problem statement coming in, interviewing, talking to people. I think this is very important for going out here and getting other viewpoints into this, observing how people are reacting to the kind of the way that we're building these questions. What if? That's when you start to visualize and brainstorm. And I would say behind this is looking at a lot of throwaway prototypes, not getting too involved. You're just basically as a focus to a large degree on having an MVP that can be tested and validated. That way, if it isn't really coming across to what you're envisioning, or it's not helping your users accomplish their goals, it's easier to go back and come back and reiterate. What wows? I think this is where it comes in, of course, with the desirability we talked about earlier on Peter Morville's ideas. Working at times co-creating, and I think it's good also to come out here and have throwaways, even if it's on something like here, like up on a whiteboard. If you can get your clients involved, oftentimes other key stakeholders, it makes it much easier to get people involved in the process, helps them feel that they have some type of ownership in it. And then again, of course, of what works. That's when it comes back to still keeping things on a tight time frame, that you can iterate and see if there are any sort of sticking points, whether it comes down to design or to technical challenges. My process, I've kind of adapted a little bit from each. I would say the main thing what I've learned is to have empathy for all project members. I mean, it's easy, for example, for us to go and get focused into our own little silos and start to forget about how everybody else plays their role in a part of the team. And again, the focus on a rapid time frame. As far as the discovery process is concerned, I think this is important, and I think this took me a while to generate these skills too, is to being able to ask the proper questions to stakeholders to find the actual goal. And I know oftentimes it can be kind of challenging to find out how exactly people are looking to accomplish their end goal. Requirements gathering, again, I think this comes down to asking a lot of careful questions. Sometimes this comes only through experience. Securing buy-in from key stakeholders, I think, is also something that's very critical, especially in larger organizations. Jared Spool has talked about executive swoop and poop. Part of what that comes into is, I mean, some of us probably have bad experience with this, where there's a stakeholder on the client team that has a very powerful input, but really isn't that active in the process, kind of lurking in the shadows. And of course, what can happen is you may come down that the majority of the team may like what you're working on for your client side, it only comes up to the very end when one of these key people kind of swoops in and decides that this isn't the way it's going to be going and you're back to square one. And that's why I think it's important, as I'll show in the process, to come out here and have a number of milestones and deliverables to begin with to keep people involved, even if they're not really from the beginning. Personas are also good to build with, and I know that some agencies may come out here and spend a lot of time and money on it. Jared Spool talks about that too. Part of the challenge I would say on that is to make sure that that they're not too elaborate, that you're not focusing too much on actually building up a character as if we were doing a major Hollywood feature. The main thing is just to have some sort of a use case that you can have for somebody that you can build up this process around, kind of that helps you understand it from the process that you're working on from the standpoint of an end user. As far as the tool set is concerned, what I will stress, at least from my standpoint and my experience coming in, is to keep things probably as simple and throwaway as possible. I even rely on paper for a lot of this, even though our projects are all digital. I think the main thing behind it is, of course, is that it emphasizes that a lot of this is going to come in and it's throwaway. It's mostly out here for research and discovery. I would say for interviewing, another key thing, and I've even heard this from talking from leading studios up in the DC area, it's often good if you're doing interviewing to have two people. One is doing the actual interviewing, the other is doing note-taking. I even noticed this on sessions here I've attended here at DrupalCamp Atlanta. Sometimes I get too busy taking notes, I'm missing a lot of key details. Next stage coming in is iterate. This is when you're incorporating research and requirements into a prototype. Again, using low-fidelity tools that allow for rapid testing and validation. I think, of course, coming back from the way that I kind of approach things, the sprints are excellent because it focuses everybody to put out a product. And I think if you have impossibly short time frames at times, it actually forces people to get creative and think up a lot of novel ideas that oftentimes would be thrown away if you had more time to develop towards a traditional type of project. And, of course, when possible, involve stakeholders here as well. As far as suggested tools, I'm still at paper mostly at this phase. I went up here and took the time to build up even a lot of mocks that I have to keep things organized. Say if it comes down to responsive web projects coming up here, making sure that it's going to be mobile first, even a basic storyboarding and script lines to come in. And again, just to have this up here that you can throw it up. Some clients that are used to traditional processes may be kind of reluctant to look at paper prototypes. But I find also it kind of lowers the barrier to entry because they can actually see the way things are building up. And I think at times it may even change their perceptions of the project and get more involved and start thinking about it more from the end user as well. Build process, that's the next stage. That's when the best prototypes are being incorporated into the beta product. Again, testing as much as possible. Even if you can do some sort of guerrilla UX testing with people not involved in the process, I would say that's very good. You can often uncover valuable insights doing it this way. Making things as modular as possible, and I think this is great with D8 now, with the way things are going, especially with the code and CMI, is that we can even do it from the build standpoint. It's no longer like we're working on this monolithic project. That comes down to design systems as well. And again, if major issues are discovered, to look on for iterating, making sure that's where modularity will come in too. It may be kind of bad for one part of the process, but if we've been taking a fairly good look at the big picture, it shouldn't be that insurmountable. Going down to the tool set, of course, this is when it's moving into code. I would still say is to make sure you've got the spirit of collaboration, that you can break down the barriers between team members. Starting to test it out on a number of different devices, but just, of course, as I stressed a number of times, is to make sure that it still is possible to come back and change things if possible. Coming into review, the next stage, this is where functional testing, making sure the project is performing as advertised. Still testing as much user testing as possible, both in-house and out-of-house, especially if it comes down to challenging bandwidth requirements. Security is another thing I can't break up. I've worked on major Drupal projects before. Even on government projects, came up with some very embarrassing situations coming up. There could have even been possible legal issues coming up from this. And these were projects that had big budgets and took a lot of time frames. What happened, though, is because security wasn't seen as a key requirement here. I guess maybe because it wasn't a profit, there wasn't any money exchanging hands, it's kind of left aside. There was a government project I was working on at one point. How this came out and of the security issues within Drupal, and it was kind of simple to resolve, but what had happened is this was a project that was serving minority women that were having some sort of abusive situations. Part of the challenge behind the project was, of course, that they were putting a lot of sensitive information up to be helped. Allegedly, this was supposed to be secured. One of the women for whom this project was designed for actually went out here and did a Google search on herself. To her shock, a lot of this information that should have been private was publicly available. This came down to something simple as basically when it did the role permissions within one of the views, which in the site was built in Drupal, hadn't even been checked for making sure that was secure. And again, I think what it comes down to on some of the projects, knowing this client particularly, they were more concerned on the atmospherics than they were on the functionality and the security. And that's why I think that some of this needs to be tested and also seen as a key requirement that would come in through iterations. I think even one of the personas you may want to look at is maybe even having some sort of a gray hat or black hat in how they would approach your project. And again, if major issues are discovered, that's when you're still going to be looking at rebuilding and doing more iteration. As far as the tool set is concerned, this is basically whatever your team is comfortable at this point. As I had mentioned before, also for a lot of bandwidth challenges on projects and testing as much as possible. As far as deployment, that's going to be the final stage coming up. Once you've met most of your requirements, looking into the launch. And I think, to tell you the truth, is there's a lot when it comes out here is paying attention to users. No matter how much exhaustive research we do, you never know how it's going to be until things are actually launching. And I think that's where a careful attention to not only the analytics, but even talking to people informally may come up and have a lot of observations you may not have accounted for. And again, if any major issues are discovered, the review and adapt as needed. As far as the tool set, of course, that's what your team is comfortable with. And I would stress that the process doesn't stop here. Just the path is continual improvement. A lot of people still think, in the traditional mindset, that you have a product, you pushed out the door, and that's it. Sure, there may be security updates, but no. A lot of sites that work really well, sometimes we may not even be perceptive of it unless we compare, say, a snapshot from a year ago today versus the present. But they're continual improvements, and a lot of this comes in from talking to people, coming out and seeing what's happening when it's out in the wild. As far as the project example is concerned, this was a fairly sizable Drupal project I had worked on in the past year. It was all volunteer. It was for the UXPA International 2016 site that was held out in Seattle back in May and June. Some of the challenges we had on it, this was going to be a conference site that was going to be built from the ground up in Drupal, and there was only a two-person team. I was doing the design and the front end and UX, and I had another volunteer in the DC area was working on the back-end development, which required a lot of customization. Part of that challenge in the custom coding is the UXPA International site was built up in Drupal with a lot of customization, and it was kind of difficult for getting the two sites to interact with one another, especially when sharing a lot of membership data for doing the registration. We, of course, have a demanding UX-centric user base, and sometimes I would say we had challenges that were greater than working even with a regular client. People are extremely picky, but they won't tell you about why exactly they're picky. It's sometimes just throwing it out there and seeing how they're going to react to it. And due to prior experience, no printed program would be used. This came into good user research, and I had worked on the 2015 site. As I had said, most of my earlier career experience was in print design. And what we found out here is because this conference is so large, of course, things change on the fly. There were a number of sessions throughout the conference. It lasted about a week. We found, though, is when it came down to, of course, as I had mentioned also earlier in the process about believability, the problem is once one single session had a minor change in it, nobody else took the print program to actually be reliable anymore and basically didn't even deal with it. And from that, we were looking at saving costs and keeping things as up-to-date as possible. We made sure that the schedule that was going to be on the site had to be performant on mobile devices, and that was going to be the sole schedule that people were going to have to refer to. And of course, there would be a careful balance of performance and features, especially since UXPA International didn't have any type of budget for a CDN or other types of advanced web features. We did have a fairly decent web host, but that was basically on our shoulders to make sure that we would be able to deliver a good experience. This is the finished product. As you see right here, of course, have the desktop site, have a tablet site, have a mobile site. This is all being built up in Drupal. Wanted to make sure that it was going to be as modular as possible, since a lot of this information would be changing throughout the conference. In addition, they wanted to have a very corporate feel. Of course, you have to start with a large hero image. All of this is responsibly served for good performance. The main thing behind it is we were focusing on the content, having as minimal decoration as possible. Part of the challenge we had this is because, like I had said, there were some rather complex interactions that were going on between two sites. I take the time when I'm working on projects. Yes, this may take a little bit to set up, but when you're explaining this, and I think when we were making the case, especially to the volunteer organization team, I think when you show the visualizations of a lot of these processes, it actually helps them understand the complexity. It also helped us in building the site and understanding the development challenges and where we could have potential bottlenecks. That even came down to mapping the data flow for enough of the information we had. And I think this is also where we start coming in here about user experience, because we start to see not only how we need to get this data to work, but how users are going to be dealing with this as well. Site architecture is another thing that I found often gets left by the wayside. This was something that was also through the discovery process on the UXPA 2015 site. There was way too much information in the main navigation. And since, of course, as we came up closer to the conference and during the conference, some of those, some things that may have been important in the beginning, like, say, securing sponsors and advertising, or, say, general signups to volunteers would no longer be important. So we'd be looking on basically on setting a hierarchy on what would need to be where at different times during the conference. And this also helps settle a lot of arguments that we would have with working with people on the site as well. As far as the comping process, as I had shown earlier, this is basically we're going into small mocks of coming in here, working on putting a lot of this for rapid iteration coming in. Easy enough for, I think, and what also helps this is with writing. Once you start putting things down on the paper, I think it makes you think in a more structured way. And I found this a very quick way of getting things together for this project. It would be fairly complex. As far as wireframing is concerned, this is what I start to share with the team. A lot of this, of course, is kept as low fidelity as possible, no color or typography. The main thing behind it is also coming back here, is what I look at here is making sure that a lot of this is annotated, that people understand the process. Different members of the team can be seeing this. And I found also, when it comes down to stakeholders on the team, when they see that you're documenting a lot of this and putting a lot of this information out there, it really increases your standing and your ability to make the case. Also helps them get more involved. It also comes down to visual assets. As you can see here for the style tile over here on the left, some of the aspects, like say the hero image, the top of the site was a little bit different. The main thing behind it is, of course, is you're looking on getting buy-in from different elements, so it's easier to move further on. Typography and things could be resolved, colors could be resolved, interactive elements such as button states, even coming in here and like some of the more esoteric aspects like the feel of the entire site can be resolved. That over there on the right-hand side, this is all static mark. There's no code or anything involved at this point here, all using visual tools. The main thing behind it is, as you can see, most of the site design and user experience aspects have already been resolved by this point, before we've even done any code. As far as interactive mocks, this is where I highly stress using tools such as InVision. Here, no code has been written at this point either. Part of the main aspect, though, about going out here and having an interactive a comp that we could have for different team members to resolve is coming up here as the program. Last year, one of the criticisms of it was that it was overly complex. The main thing behind it here is, even though this is all dummy data, I wanted to have team members come in and do a test on this if they were a conference attendee and looking at, say, filtering by track and different session information, they could drill down. They wanted to have a lot of information, they could go to a specific session node. But this way we were looking on how people could accomplish their tasks most quickly in an easy fashion. Part of the, I would say another example of why using a tool like InVision is good is because our team was distributed all over the country. The head of the organization for this year is based in the Dallas area, was traveling a lot. The number 2 was out in the Seattle area working for Microsoft. Other members of the team were constantly traveling. So at least with something like InVision, anyone could come down here once they'd gotten the link, download it onto whatever mobile device they had, and could be testing it out and giving us feedback. This is one of the biggest challenges I had on this project, both from a design and a coding standpoint. I've worked with trade associations and conferences and events through my entire career. I have never seen anything that had a pricing table this complex. And we actually had refined it quite a bit. I had to go out here and even when we got the Excel spreadsheet for coming out here and trying to clean it up. But of course, as I said from the beginning, this was to be a mobile-first design. So sure, coming up with a table and putting this up, say, as a static table and just style it like we would have over on the left here, that's pretty easy to do. But to make sure that this is going to be responsive and actually work for mobile users here is a bit of a challenge. I had looked into a number of different frameworks. came up with basically finding that observe responsive tables was probably the best way to do it. I had to do a lot of customization, and even there's small user affordances in here. Like, say, for example, there's some of this text that alerts users that they're able to swipe on a mobile device. That all is shown and hidden by CSS. In addition, some of the careful gradations that show that that's a swipeable area, that also only shows up in the mobile breakpoint as well. It did take a lot of time for us to basically go through here, clean this up, have it in a usable format, but the main thing we wanted to make sure is actually, because staff would be extremely pressured to have to be available at times, we wanted to make sure that it would be as clear and concise and answer as many questions without a lot of staff input. I think, at least from what we had heard, this was a great improvement over what we had had in prior years. Form design is another thing. And like I said, of course, because we were basically only a two-person team, we didn't have a lot of time to do any customization from the outset. A lot of what you see here, the base underlying, is just stock Drupal commerce. I took a lot of time to the research from a user standpoint of coming up here and using CSS to clean up a lot of this. One of the things that's often left by the wayside when it comes down to complex forms is some of the standard HTML elements like radio buttons, selects, and the like. They may be fine if somebody's sitting at a desktop computer. The problem is, of course, is for tap areas, especially for people with large fingers. It's one of the things that I did enough user testing and experimentation to make sure that even if you had a large finger, that the tap areas would be large enough for people to work. Also using color and other elements to separate it and make sure that the form elements would still be readable and a good experience at all sizes. Program UX was another thing that we really looked into. Like I said in the past, there was just way too much information. It was set up by a designer doing a lot of static comping and not really testing for mobile. We wanted to make sure that everything was going to work for mobile at all breakpoints. In addition to desktop, sure, we made sure that things were kept simple. More of this was coming down and getting straight to the point. That included layouts, and these were linked from every event session that would actually have an event at a certain level inside the conference center. Make sure that this would all work on the devices. All these are vector elements, including SVGs. It took some time to redraw some of these things, but I think that the end result was worth the effort. Staff administration is something that often on Drupal projects I found to be left by the wayside, including some I've had to take over and work on large projects. A lot of the members of our team were not that technically savvy, so we wanted to make sure, for example, when checking up for enough of registrants and things like this, things that often happen during a conference, wanted to make sure that they would be working well, especially even on mobile devices. This still also uses responsive tables. A lot of different form details to be checking on, but we wanted to make sure that this is something that could work. Some of this even had to be generated on the fly during the conference. As far as the takeaways from this project, we felt from what you had seen that registration was up. It's helped to a large degree by an improved user experience. Of course, doing with mobile first, since more of where this is moving, we found that it did work as well for replacing the schedule. We also were looking for improved integration with surveys and presentations. And the staff functionality, I think that was good for the way that we were doing it from that standpoint. And of course, to reiterate then with my process, is just to make sure that you're thinking of all users, including your developers and end users, and to make sure that close collaboration is employed throughout the entire process. And Kirsten has another project example here.
So this is the point at which I like to say, we throw you like a lot of stuff all at once, and if you noticed, Karl talks really fast. So that is a lot of information we've given you. And what was really important for the way that that Karl has done the slides is that the source material is on all those slides. So if you need any more information about any of the different people that he has just talked about, please take a look at the source information. One of the things that made this session in general possible was that Karl came to my office and talked about user experience. And everyone was like, oh, user experience is the big new hot topic. It's not new. It's not a hot topic even. It's something that we should all be doing all the time. Now, I am not a designer. I am just a developer. I say just because the stuff that Karl can do, this amazing, pretty stuff, I do not do. But there are parts of Karl's process that really work well with thinking about how to empathize with our users. So we mentioned earlier about personas. I'm going to talk about personas. I do not have any slides about this because we have not deployed the site, but I'm going to talk about personas for a second. On a project I am working on, we developed personas. And in doing that, we discovered that we didn't really know who our users were. We really had this idea that everyone who was reading our site was probably in academia. Then we discovered through the personas and analyzing all of our analytics, we had a lot of people who were using like a mini Opera mobile phone, about 10% of our users. We'd like to grow that population. So how do you optimize for these low bandwidth, low JavaScript kinds of mobile environments? So based on this persona of this user who's probably in like India or Africa, we decided that we would minimize JavaScript. So our new site, when we actually deploy, will have minimal JavaScript. And on mobile devices, it pretty much goes away. We know now, after doing our personas, that most of our users, they're coming to our content to read it. They're literally reading it. So we needed to put the words up front. And before, everyone wanted to do all the pretty stuff, all of the beautiful pictures, and it doesn't work for our site. So we minimized it. Now, you'll get to see that site in January, and then I'll update our slides to include that stuff. We'll have to watch Karl's or my Twitter feed, and you can find that stuff out. So, moving on. I'm going to talk about the Department of Commerce. I am not a member of this project. I did not do this work, but I got to follow the project and how it was run for the better part of a year when they did basically a major redesign where they stood up 2 sites at once. The old site and the completely different look and feel on a beta. What it allowed them to do was to take feedback from their users, which they hadn't done in the past. So they encouraged people to go to the beta site, leave comments. They also provided walkthroughs, which we'll show in a second, of how they're going to be restructuring their content, and then they provided ways for people to understand why they made the decisions they made. So here was the original Department of Commerce site. Looks very government-like, doesn't it? This is the new site. This is actually one of the original beta test ones. And you'll see they have the walkthroughs. They describe why the process is going to happen. They provide a way for you to provide feedback. And then they experiment throughout the process, and you can watch this on the Wayback Machine. Just pull up commerce.gov, and you can watch their process of changing the front page. They also changed, you'll notice that they're going to change these icons as well. Some people could see some or understand them, and others could not. As time went by, they figured out that this wasn't helping anymore, so they dropped the walkthroughs. They changed how they were doing the gallery pictures and dropped them off the bottom of the page. They're still on the front page. They no longer take up valuable room where they needed to get content to their users first. They found out through all of this feedback, people wanted to share information too, so now they actually have added all the social media icons. You'll notice data has changed. And even though there's no longer in beta, they still take feedback. So what's really great about the particular project that they did was that they actually did a beta test. I don't know if you know anything about government sites. We don't beta test. It is very rare to see a site side by side as they're trying to do the migration. They didn't really do the migration. They just kept updating both sites. They changed, as you can see, the line graphs, the social icons. They added new icons and overlays were removed. Images were moved below the fold. They did all of these things based on their user feedback. This is one of those things that Karl talks about in the process. It's pulling that stuff in and using that information to actually create better experiences for our users. They used the feedback to get buy-in, and that feedback made it possible for them to do something that no other government agencies do. So one of the things that we really, really advocate for is something that Brian Olendijk, who, if you read Twitter, he's always talking about AY11, A11Y, which is accessibility material and information. He's the one who's behind ELMS. If you work in education, you may have heard of ELMS. It's a project from Penn State. He is also dyslexic. He talks about that, so I think I'm fine with saying that about him. Sorry, Brian, if you're listening. He pointed out recently about dyslexia and having different fonts for it. Knowing that we have users who are dyslexic, who are reading our content, we know this already from our personas, that we decided for my new project, we're going to actually be using a dyslexic font for easier use for people who have disabilities reading material. And it doesn't just work for dyslexics, at least the font that we're trying to use. It works for other cognitive disabilities as well. So it's kind of nice to be able to see that we're not taking features here. It's a benefit to our users. In addition, if you can beta test where possible, that's that you can do the guerrilla UX experience stuff by doing the paper stuff and going on a street and getting people's feedback. Or do it the hard way, like Commerce has. In order to get buy-in, they had to do it the hard way. I don't know if they would ever try and do that again, but I like the idea, just not a whole year of it. Additionally, if you can, minimum viable product. Really important on that one. And that is actually something that we're trying this year with GovCon, the big event that Karl and I work on in DC. We have about 1,000 people who attend our event, which is all Drupal related. It's not just government, it's just government attendees cannot attend if government isn't in the name, so we have to have gov in the name. And we really have the same needs and use cases as everyone else does. But this year we're actually doing an MVP. COD isn't quite ready for D8, and we decided we are. So we're building this in Drupal 8 and learning as we go, and we've decided we're doing an MVP for it. And I think our first build is up and running, at least on local environments now.
Yes.
As of yesterday night. Also, understand your user flow, and I think Karl can talk to these next couple.
And again, developing personas. And as I had mentioned in the past, that Jared Spool had talked about too, he's one of the leading UX people, travels around the country, sometimes internationally. The thing behind it is to make sure that you're not really coming in here and building like an actual, even believable, fully fleshed out character. Just to have some sort of an amalgamated feel of your general use cases. Just something that you can actually have that you can walk through and help advocate your case from the end user standpoint. And of course, as Kirsten had mentioned too, is rinse and repeat as much as needed, since users and use cases changes over time. And that's what I had stressed earlier, is when it comes down to a lot of UX, it's sort of like architecture, and even for major architectural projects. I mean, you have an architect assigned to a building even years after completed, because there are constant repairs and changes that need to be made. And a major website that's public facing, of course, is the same way, especially with the way technology and use cases change. As far as building support in your organization, I think that's, of course, as critical as to involve key stakeholders. That helps to ensure the buy-in. I would say especially if you're starting out and you haven't really done that much with UX to begin with, is having a lot of in-house success stories helps to strengthen your case. And even if you're starting out, it's just a note by external stories like Kirsten had done with her example. Making others aware of the process. Even if you have an intranet site, if you have an area in your office, if you're not a distributed team, that you have a lot of information. Even if you're not, there are plenty of portfolio sites and other information where even free resources where you can post information. That lets people know that you're working on a project and how much work and planning actually goes into that. Helps strengthen your case. And then there are government initiatives for those of you working in a nonprofit field like U.S. Digital Service that can also offer services. And of course, empathize all the time that what helps the user ultimately helps you. Tim Cook sums it up pretty well. Oftentimes, we're kind of wrapped up on our self-interest and not on on our users. And if our users aren't happy, how are we actually going to continue existing? As far as organizations are concerned, I'd recommend for UXPA International, AIGA's gotten more UX focused. Design thinking, that's how I got involved, is just having local meetup groups. Even local and design-related meetups. So we have in our area, for example, like, say, Drupal meetups, others as well. And there's a wealth of information on online communities, including D.O. As far as additional reading, I'll have this up. I'd highly recommend some of these project books. And thank you for the opportunity to present today.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions. And I know that's a lot of information we've thrown at you, and it's probably a little bit dense. But we really think that it's important as developers or site builders that you become advocates for your users. Because if you're building a feature that no one ever freaking uses, hey, that might be a great feature, but who cares? I've done that before, and it's painful because I feel like it's just sunk cost. It's just my time has been put in this wonderful feature that no one is going to use, and why did I bother? All right, anybody have questions? Comments? And because we are also into that whole feedback loop, feel free to give us comments about how we can improve this process.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.